This is Manhattan, business center of New York City and heart of the city's life.
Now let's have motion pictures take us behind the scenes of a great railroad at work.
History of the High Line, starting in the 1840s, a bunch of business people in New York came together and planned a railroad. From the 1840s into the early 1900s, it was the primary artery to get people and things in and out of New York City.
As soon as those tracks got laid, almost from the very beginning in the mid-1800s, there was this problem of the trains traveling at grade level in a crowded city and the accidents that they caused.
And it used to run down on 10th Avenue, and it was called Death Avenue because so many people were run over by the trains.
For a short period of time, the New York Central, who began to run the railroad at that point, actually hired people to ride on horses that were called the West Side Cowboys, and they ran out in front of the trains with red flags, warning people that the trains were coming.
But in 1929, the city, the state, and the New York Central Railroad came together in an historic agreement, the biggest transportation infrastructure project in New York City, known as the West Side Improvement. And what it did basically was eliminate grade crossings along the west side of Manhattan.
Early 1930s, the High Line section was completed. From Canal Street up to 34th Street, it was 21 feet above ground. Warehouses in that area were rebuilt so they could handle freight up at the second or third level.
The early bird gets underway. Destination, New York.
Starting in 1934, it got a new nickname, which was the Lifeline of New York, because it brought in a lot of food. A lot of the warehouses were old food warehouses. There's most famously the Nabisco factory, which is now Chelsea Market.
After World War II, as manufacturing left New York City, the need for heavy freight rail really began to diminish. Into the 1960s, you basically had the traffic north of there begin to just disappear.
And in the 1960s, part of it from Clarkson to Bank Street was demolished.
And then there was another demolition in 1990 that brought it up to Gansevoort Street, which is where it ends today.
Well, CSX and its predecessors date back to 1827, and we're stewards of a marvelous infrastructure that goes through thousands of communities in the eastern United States. We're primarily a freight railroad, of course. That's our bread and butter.
Well, we acquired the property as part of our acquisition of Conrail, and having almost a mile and a half of property through Lower Manhattan is highly unusual. There's nothing else like it.
When we first came to see the High Line in its aging quality, we realized that this was a property no longer used for rail operations and that we had to find some use for the property into the future.
The High Line had some issues. It was a subject of ongoing lawsuits. It had some deterioration that was being pointed out by building inspectors and others.
So the first strategy, immediately after Conrail was acquired, the push was to demolish it. We didn't necessarily think that was a great thing, but that seemed to be what the city wanted and all the interests wanted.
One of the first things that CSX did was commission a study on what to do about the High Line from the Regional Plan Association.
We listened to others who had ideas on how this property might be utilized, everything from a horizontal parking lot to a rolling billboard.
One of the possible solutions that came out of that report was rail banking.
Well, rail banking is the idea that when lines of railroad become no longer useful for freight usage, interested parties and communities, governmental agencies, can work out a consensual arrangement with the freight railroad to reuse the right-of-way for trail and other park-like purposes.
I live in the West Village and always seen the High Line, but really didn't give it that much thought. And then I read an article in the New York Times that it was going to be demolished.
So in that newspaper article, CSX mentioned the openness to the idea of doing some kind of park proposal on the High Line.
I went to my first community board meeting where I heard CSX was presenting a study that they had commissioned from the RPA about different uses.
I sat next to Robert, coincidentally, and the discussion about the High Line began.
CSX basically said they were looking at all different kinds of options, but most people in the room either didn't care at all or really wanted to tear it down.
Then we began to look at how could you build an organization with a mission of preserving the structure and figuring out an exciting way to reuse it.
We realized we were the only two people really interested in it. So we exchanged business cards, and that's how we started Friends of the High Line.
We went and approached CSX about the idea.
It was really through the friends of the High Line who got the ball going on this and started to create the drama and the enthusiasm for this public park.
One of the single most important things that happened to save the High Line in the very early days was when CSX made it possible for Joel Sternfeld's project to photograph the High Line. They basically made it possible for the world to see what was on top of the High Line.
When you got up there was 1.5 miles of wildflowers running right through the middle of Manhattan with views of the Empire State Building and the Statue of Liberty, and that's really when I fell in love with it.
It was so spectacular and so unusual that you couldn't let go after that.
We were invited to visit an earlier administration of the city of New York, and I had the opportunity of meeting with the deputy mayor, who told us as we walked in the door that our High Line was the biggest blight in the city of New York.
We really didn't own land, we owned rights. We owned property rights, but they were in the air. We owned an aerial easement. We own a concrete and steel structure, but it overrides other properties owned by other people whose ability to develop their property in the future is severely impacted by the fact that it has this big railroad structure over it.
A group of property owners came to City Hall wheeling a cart on which there was a big chunk of concrete that had fallen from the High Line onto somebody's property. And this was how they made their case for why the city needed to tear down the High Line as soon as possible, because in their view it was a threat to health and safety of people in the area.
The city during the years from the 80s to the 90s agreed with the property owners. They also felt there was no opportunity for development of the High Line and that it was a blight, and they were really looking to get this part of the city developed.
The Meatpacking District and West Chelsea were already beginning to transform. There were galleries coming in, more restaurants. The previous administrations looked at the High Line as something that if it came down, we could just really redevelop the neighborhood.
Here you have this neighborhood that's so close to so many other prime parts of Manhattan.
The wieners are packed in carton.
And yet the zoning still prescribed largely manufacturing uses that had left this city decades ago and that wasn't coming back.
And there are people who have a right to feel the other way about it.
And it got to the point where in the final days of the Giuliani administration, papers were signed that would have committed the city to participating in a demolition agreement for the High Line.
The public wants their...
There was a real turning point in the city's policy towards the High Line in sort of 2001, 2002 timeframe, and it's really attributable to one simple reason, a change in mayoral administration.
The High Line's a good idea. We don't have anything like it in this city.
The Bloomberg administration understood the visions that the Friends had for the reuse of the line, as well as our desires for the reuse of the line as a public park.
Coincident with the redevelopment of the High Line, there was a city policy to encourage the redevelopment of the entire neighborhood, and that required a rezoning.
But how do we figure out how to use the city's interest in upzoning with the community's interest in preserving this immediate area and the interest in preserving the High Line itself as a park, and combining those things using a tool called the Transfer of Development Rights, or TDRs as they're known.
For example, assume that a property owner whose property is encumbered by the High Line has the legal right to build a 6-story building, but because of the High Line can really only build a 1-story building. We created the right for the adjacent property owner to theoretically build a 10-story building, but only gave them the air rights to enable them to build a 5-story building. How could they build a 10-story building? They had to purchase 5 stories from the property owner whose site lay underneath the High Line.
And at that point, everybody was able to come together over the next couple of years on an agreement where the underlying property owners would be able to get the benefit of these transferred development rights, where the railroad would be indemnified for any liabilities with the city getting the ability to zone the way it wanted to zone, and the Friends being able to preserve the line in its entirety.
This has been a moment that I know we've all been eagerly awaiting.
After Mayor Bloomberg came in office, we started thinking about design. We did a real design competition in 2004 where we actually selected the design team of James Corner Field Operations and Diller Scofidio and Renfro.
We broke ground in April of 2006. Seeing the transformation of this structure beginning was just incredibly moving and beautiful.
The design and construction really achieved the goals of reclaiming a usable past.
The planting is really one of the things that's so special about the High Line. It was done by a garden designer named Pete Gouldoff, and he really was inspired by this wild landscape that was growing. But now it changes every 2 weeks.
And we opened the first section in 2009.
It was such an outstanding success when it first opened that they had to limit access that summer.
Before we opened, we thought maybe 300,000 people would come a year. Last year we had 3.7 million visitors, and this year we'll definitely have over 4 million visitors. So it's far exceeded anything that we thought of.
Every time I look at it, I have to almost pinch myself. You know, I'll be walking in the area and I'll hear people talking on the phone and they'll say, you know, I'll meet you at the High Line.
And then we opened this second section from 20th to 30th Street in 2011.
And in coming years, we hope to open the final section at the West Side Rail Yards, bringing us to 34th Street.
Well, I think CSX is extremely proud to be part of a project that has been so successful.
It has become an enormous icon of New York City now, and it's a place that people come from all over the world to see it.
And that I think everybody who worked on the project, whether at Friends of the High Line, at CSX, or at the city, we're all grateful for having played a part in something that's really going to have a lasting impact here in New York.
Everyone loves trains, and people always love that sense of the journey and the idea of looking out the window and watching a changing landscape. The High Line, I think, evokes and preserves that.
You know, Steve and Pete probably had the best understanding of how truly difficult and unlikely this would be, and yet they were willing to work with us and, you know, give us that opening that helped make it all happen.